So like Bonnie said, we're making our way through the book of Matthew, which Matthew is one of 4 books in the New Testament that we call Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus written by 4 different people from their own unique perspectives. Matthew is one of 2, Matthew and John, that are eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. Matthew was one of what we call the 12 or the apostles. He was friends with Jesus. He was there with Jesus. So Matthew's writing what he saw and what he experienced. And he's kind of using it to say like, hey, this is what happened during Jesus' life. And because of this, here's what I believe, here's what I think, here's who he is. And so Matthew, as we've been making our way through Matthew's gospel, we've been unpacking all of these different like themes that Matthew shares. Matthew tells us a lot about the background of Jesus, where he came from, not even just like his birth, but even kind of into his family tree, his connection into the nation of Israel. Matthew talks a lot about Jesus' identity. Who is he? Who did he claim that he was? Who did other people think that he was? We've talked a lot about Jesus, his teachings, what he said, what he taught, the stories that he told, the miracles that he performed. But everything that Matthew's telling us about Jesus kind of revolves around really one central idea, one central theme. And we're going to explore that today by asking this like one word simple question. Why? Why? Matthew, if you look at it, Matthew believed that God came to earth in the person of Jesus. That's who Jesus is. That the God who created the universe actually came to earth embodied as a flesh and blood human being. Now, Jesus was God. He was also fully human. He wasn't like half and half or 50-50. He was 100% of both. He was fully God, fully human. And the question is, if that's true, which it's a difficult thing to accept, right? It is. There's probably a lot of us in here that's really what we believe, that yes, Jesus was God who came to earth and he was human, he was a man. A lot of us probably wrestle with it, don't know what to think, and it is a difficult thing to wrestle with. It's interesting when you look through the writing of the New Testament, but even the writings of the early church, even the early church struggled with understanding this. Like, what does this really mean and what does it actually look like? But for Matthew, this is like kind of his core conviction, that this is who Jesus is. That Jesus is God and he came to earth in human form. That is, he's fully God, he's fully human. And if Matthew's right, like if that is who really Jesus is, the question is, why? Why would he do that? Why would an all-powerful God willingly take on the fragile form of a human being? Now, ancient mythologies, like if you're familiar with Greek mythology, we kind of study Greek mythology a lot, talk about Greek mythology a lot. Ancient mythologies were filled with stories of gods coming down to earth and kind of like appearing as a human. Like Zeus and stuff, they would do that all the time. Typically, though, it was really just for their own pleasure. They wanted to come down and it was usually either had to do with power or sex, honestly, is what it was. And they were never like really human. They looked like humans, but they were always, Zeus or Hera or Hermes or whatever. But the way the New Testament describes God coming down in the person of Jesus is completely different. Here's how Paul describes it in a letter he writes to the church in Philippi. This is him, as best as he can, trying to describe the nature of Jesus, God in the flesh. Here's what he says. He says, who being in very nature God, that's who he was, like in his essence, in his core, but he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So as much as mythologies may have had stories that like, hey, yeah, the gods from time to time, they would come down and they would usually do something to cause a bunch of trouble. There is no ancient faith, religion, mythology that comes anywhere close to what Paul's saying about Jesus here. That if God was to come down to earth as a human being, why would he come down like this? Why would he empty himself of his power and his majesty and his glory and not only take on the frail form of a human being, but even suffer the worst kind of death that a human being could suffer? And this is the question we want to explore today. Why? If Matthew's right in what he's saying and what he believes, and again, he's telling us this story, and this whole story centers around this, why would God do that? Now, to understand the why, to answer this question, we have to actually step back outside of Matthew. We'll come back to Matthew in a little bit, but we have to step outside of Matthew and go all the way back to the very beginning to understand how we got to this point in the story to begin with. In the beginning, which is what the book of Genesis tells us about. Genesis is the first book in the Bible, first book in the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament. Genesis literally means origins, and Genesis talks about where everything came from. And what the writer of Genesis tells us in Genesis 1:21 is that God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. So God creates everything, and after he creates everything, God looks down and says, it's good. Now that phrase, it's good, just calling it good, what that implies is that when God created the universe and humanity and everything, that there was intent. It wasn't just like a random thing. It wasn't just like, oh, well, let's see where this goes. No, there was an intent. I'm doing this for a reason. And so when God says it's good, not only is he talking about intent, but he's also really talking about the function. Like there's a purpose for it, and it's working according to its design. So when God says it's good, that's what he's saying. That yes, I had an intention, and when I look down, everything is functioning according to the way it was designed. The creation, humanity, all of it, we were designed to function a certain way. So God creates it all, and hey, it's good. But the thing about creation, as it's told in Genesis, is creation is dynamic, which means it was never supposed to just stay. It was always going to grow. It was always going to change. And so what God did was he created human beings in his image. That's what Genesis says. We are image bearers of God. He created human beings in his image in order to steward creation on his behalf. Essentially to rule creation on his behalf. That's what it means to be made in the image of God. That we were designed to rule over creation on behalf of God. We were designed to reflect his wise and loving rule into creation and to steward it, to do something with it, to help it grow, to help it change, to help it become even better. The problem is, though, as you read Genesis and as you read through the biblical story, that's not really what happens. The whole thing ends up coming unraveled. Because humanity decides we don't want to reflect God's rule, we want to rule ourselves, because that is our very nature. Like we want to be in charge, we want things our way. So humanity rebels against God and says, we don't want to do this the way that you want us to do it. We want to do it the way that we want to, so we're going to do our own thing. And we are going to rule this the way we desire. And when that happens, everything falls apart. Everything unravels. Creation becomes fractured. Sometimes the word we use for it is creation becomes broken, or traditionally we talk about it as being the fall, that creation falls. Because what happens, remember, everything was good. There's an intent and it's functioning according to its design until humanity decides we don't want it to function according to its design. We want it to function the way that we want it to function. And so now when it doesn't work according to its design, the whole thing falls apart. This is where you get the language in Scripture of sin and death. See, sin for a lot of us, we've probably been taught that sin is like breaking a rule. As if God just arbitrarily created rules like, we should have some rules here. So don't do this, don't do this, don't do that. Sin is recognizing the fact that there's limitations in life. We were created to be certain kind of people. We were created to function in certain kind of ways. There's certain things we were created not to do. And so when we live outside of that design and intent, the result is always death. This is why the New Testament will say the wages of sin is death. It's not like you break a rule and now you're getting punished. It's no, you were created to live a certain way. When we don't live within that, when creation's not functioning good, the result of that is death. And so creation begins to literally just spiral out of control. And so the question that now God faces is, what am I going to do? I created all of this and it was good. I put my image bearers right in the middle of it to steward it, to rule and lead on my behalf, to reflect my wise and loving rule. They didn't. They took it their own direction. Now the thing is unraveling. Like when you read the first part of Genesis, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, it's story after story of how this thing just keeps unraveling. And the question for God is, what am I going to do now? Do I just, well, I gave it the old college try and you guys did what you want, so have fun. But that's not what God does. The first story of rebellion of humanity is told through the story in the Garden of Eden and with Adam and Eve. And when Adam and Eve are just there with shame and pain, which is what sin always brings us, what God does is pretty astounding because God stays with them and he actually covers their shame and their pain. And so what you see over all of these stories that happen over the next several chapters, when you get into Cain and Abel and the first two brothers and one kills the other, and then you get into Noah's Ark and it's just an absolute disaster, and you get into the Tower of Babel and all these things, as it continues to unravel, God refuses to leave. He stays, he engages, he's involved. And not only is he involved, but he's doing something. It's not just like God is occasionally like helping out, like, oh, you went too far this time, let me pull you back. No, God is actively working toward a very specific goal or end. What he's doing in the midst of all of this unraveling isn't random. He's working towards something. He's trying to do something. He has a goal or an end toward all the work that he is doing. And over time, what theologians and what biblical scholars will call this, they'll call it the Missio Dei, which is Latin for mission of God. And what they'll say is from very early on in the book of Genesis, when things begin to unravel, what you see is that God has a mission. And his mission is to save his creation. The creation, left to its own devices, is dying. Creation, the way that it's the current trajectory of creation, going all the way back to Eden, is death. That's where it's headed. But it is the mission of God to save his creation. And what's really important to understand is when the biblical writers, both in the Old and New Testament, when they talk about God and when they talk about his mission, it's not like mission is something that God does. It's literally who he is. It's like in his DNA. It's in his nature. John, one of the apostles in the New Testament, will say that God is love. Like it's his defining characteristic. Mission is described the same way. In the same way that God is love, God is mission. It's who he is. Because there's a big difference between what someone can do and what someone actually is. Right? We can do just about anything for a short period of time, but that doesn't mean it's who we are. In the early 90s, I went to Griffith Middle School in Downey, California. And all through 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, I was in band. I played trumpet. Any other band people here? Come on, own it. Let's just be proud here. There we go. I see some hands. Very good. I'm proud of you. Super proud of you. I was in band. And the thing about band at Griffith Middle School is when you were in beginning band, which I was in 6th grade, you only went to beginning band half the time. So half the days you went to beginning band, and then half the days you would go to PE. Once you got into advanced band in 7th and 8th grade, you had PE every day and you had band every day. But in 6th grade, because they had all these electives and different things you had to take, that's just the way it worked. So half the time PE, half the time band. Now the main PE coach at Griffith Middle School when I was there, his name was Coach Cunningham. And Coach Cunningham was not a tall guy, he was a little guy, he used to wear this big beach hat. And he wasn't mean in the sense that he would like belittle you or bully you or cuss you out or anything like that, but he was not a soft and friendly man. Everything he said, first of all, he called everybody hamburgers. That was, come on, hamburger, get up, come on, pick it up, hamburger, let's go. And it was especially bad if you were in band, because again, remember, in band in 6th grade, I'm with Coach Cunningham half the day and I'm in band half the day. Coach Cunningham lovingly called us Band-Aids, is what he would say. Like if he was, all right, we got the Band-Aids here today. Let's go, you hamburgers. Let's do this. And so he just, again, wasn't super like abusive or that. Just was kind of a rough guy. And even he spent so much time out in the sun, like his skin was just rough. Like if you ever shook his hand, it was like shaking a farmer's hand, where it's like, dude, it's like sandpaper. Like that's just kind of who he was. And he used to have one of those little coaches cards, those little like athletic coaches cards. And when we'd run the field, like we'd do our exercise and he'd be like, okay, go run. He would literally drive his coach's cart around and be like, pick it up, come on, let's go. Let's go, you hamburgers, you're lazy, let's do this. And so this was Coach Cunningham. This is all we ever knew about Coach Cunningham. One day when I was there, I can't remember if it was 7th or 8th grade, but it was toward Christmas because we were getting ready for our Christmas concert in band. And lo and behold, Coach Cunningham comes in to substitute for band that day. I don't know what happened. The teacher got sick or something like that. And so he comes in and I'm like, oh, great. Here we go. Dude's just gonna make fun of us. And he obviously knew nothing about band, but we had been playing these songs for a while, and we were ready. He's like, okay, why don't you guys set up, and I'll just tell you which song to play, and you can practice it. And so we set up, we get all our instruments out and everything. He gets up there, and then, again, it was a Christmas concert, so they're all like well-known Christmas songs, Christmas carols. Coach Cunningham stands up there and says, okay, let's play this one. So we start playing, and as we're playing, he's just walking around. And as he's walking around the band, he's just humming along with us. And at one point, I kid you not, there's like a tear in the corner of his eye. And we'd get done with the song, and he'd be like, that was great. Guys, that was beautiful. Let's go on to the next one. Let's play the next one. And for the entire 45 minutes, he was just like super encouraging and very gentle. And just like, this is like, I've never seen this before. This is the guy who called me a hamburger and a Band-Aid forever. But there was like this tender moment for this one, 45-minute class period. And then later on that day, when I went out to PE, it was like, welcome hamburgers. All right, here we go. Get out there, let's run. And so when I look at Coach Cunningham, like Coach Cunningham is kind of a rough guy. He's a rough guy. He could be soft and nice in moments, but that wasn't really who he was. Who he was in his core was he was like this kind of rough guy. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about missional. There's a difference between who we are and what we can do. And what the biblical writers are saying as they begin to talk about God as missional is that mission isn't something God does, it's who he is, like in his core. It's not like he begrudgingly like, oh, I guess I have to do this. No, it's a part of literally his DNA, the way he's described, his very nature. This is God in his essence is love, and God in his essence is missional. So it becomes the mission, the work, literally God's focus is to save his creation. And it's God who's going to save his creation. Now, what he does next is really fascinating. Because after you get through this whole unraveling of creation in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, story after story of it's getting worse, it's getting worse, it's getting worse, more and more death, everything falls further and further apart. What God does in Genesis 12 is fascinating because he comes to this guy, Abram, and his wife, Sarah, who they're barren. They're unable to have children. And he says, hey, come follow me, and I will actually make you into a nation. So he's going to create a people. Genesis 12, 2-3. This is what God says to Abram and Sarah. He says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And here's the big thing. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So God, out of a barren couple, he doesn't choose a nation among all the other nations, like which one do I like best? God says, let's go to where there is no life, this barren couple, let's bring life, and out of that, we're going to create a people. And the purpose of that people is to be a blessing to the nations. So God creates Israel, not for Israel's own benefit, but for the sake of the world. And so Israel as a nation, as a people, is literally born out of God's mission. Because God, the writer of Genesis has already established, hey, God is on this mission. Creation spiraling further and further out of control. God is engaging. This is his nature, this missio Dei, right? This is who he is. He is a missional God. And so what he does is create a people to partner with him in that mission, to extend his mission. God is working to save his creation, and now he's going to create a people that are going to extend his mission throughout that creation. And so this is really important. I'm going to put this on the screen, but I'll read it here. It says, God's people were not created and then given a mission. Rather, God's people came into existence because of God's mission. This is why God creates Israel. Not because he's like, oh, I need one special. God's like, no, this is how I'm going to engage in my mission. I have a mission to save creation. So the way I'm going to extend that mission is through a people. I will create a people, and my people will be the ones that carry that mission. Through them, all nations on earth will be blessed. And so creating a people is how God is engaging with his mission in the world, which that raises another question. The next question is, well, how do they do that? How does Israel, as the people of God, engage in their mission? What does that actually mean to be God's missional people in the world? Now, the story of Israel in the Old Testament is framed by this idea of covenant. That over and over again, you'll hear this language that God enters into a covenant with Israel. Covenant is it's a legally binding relationship, but the emphasis is more on the relational aspect than even on the binding part. Marriage is kind of the place that we still talk about covenant. That a covenant is a relationship that two parties enter into, and they make promises that legally bind one another, right? In marriage, it's to love, honor, and cherish as long as we both shall live. And as long as everybody lives up to the promises, the covenant upholds. And so this really is a lot of how Israel's relationship with God is described in the Old Testament, that they enter into this covenant. And what we refer to as the law, which is all these books in the Old Testament that lay out the law that God gives to Israel after he saves them from slavery in Egypt, he gives them all these laws. The laws kind of lay out the terms of the covenant. This is what it means to be the people of God. This is what you're supposed to do. But I think sometimes what we miss is the foundation of the covenant is not the law. But it's not the law. The law is how you keep the covenant going. The law, this is what it means to be faithful to the covenant. But the covenant itself is not based on the law. The covenant itself really simply comes down to this, Exodus 6:7. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. The covenant is based on that relationship. I'm your God, and you are my people. And the foundation of the covenant is ultimately God's presence with his people. Because in the law, one of the things God tells Moses, Exodus 25:8, he says this, have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. That's the foundation of the covenant. The foundation of the covenant is, I will dwell among you. I will live among you. So first, Israel builds a tabernacle, which is like a big tent in the middle of their camp. When they settle down in the land of Canaan, what you and I know as Israel and the Palestinian territories, they'll build a temple and God will move in there. And so the foundation of the covenant is right in the middle of God's people, God dwells. God lives. And so it's God's presence among Israel, and then God's mission is extended by Israel's presence among the world. This is how covenant works. Covenant works based on presence. God is with Israel. Israel then is with the world. So God is doing what he's doing in and among Israel, and then Israel, through their presence in the world, by the way that they engage other nations and other people, they extend God's work to all the nations. All nations will be blessed through you. So this is actually how covenant works. Covenant works based on presence. God will be present with Israel. Israel is to be present within the world. And this is the way that God's work will become manifest and visible throughout all of creation. Isaiah in the Old Testament, one of the prophets, says, all of creation is filled with God's glory. That God is at work everywhere. Within the people of God, God's work is not limited to just among God's people. God is God, and he is at work in the whole world. But what it takes for God's work to become visible is a community of people submitted to God. That's where God's work becomes visible. That's where it becomes manifest. That's where people can actually see it. And so God is at work in the Missio Dei to save all of creation. He lives specifically among Israel, and Israel, through their presence in the world, is extending God's mission through their life, because Israel is to show the world, hey, here's what it's like when you live the way you were designed. Here's what it's like when you live with God in charge instead of greed or money or whatever else may be in charge. Now the problem is, Israel never really upholds their end of the covenant. Israel's never really faithful. The law is really kind of what defines covenant faithfulness, and Israel's never really faithful to that. And so the covenant ends up falling apart. In 586 BCE, Babylon marches in, conquers Israel, and Israel is no more. Now that doesn't mean that God's mission has failed, that the Missio Dei has failed. It also doesn't mean that God is giving up on his strategy of using a people to extend his mission. But there is now some work that needs to be done. Because Israel, as the missional people of God, that whole thing kind of fell apart and it didn't work. And so what is God going to do now? So God is going to continue to engage in the Missio Dei. He's got to get the Missio Dei back on track because it appears like it's suffered at least a little setback. And he's also got to reform out of the ashes, he's got to reform his people and re-equip them for mission and kind of give them a different understanding of what it means to be the missional people of God. And so the way he does that is, surprise, surprise, through presence. Through his presence. God lived in the tabernacle and in the temple. But when that all falls apart, what God does is he physically enters into his own creation in the person of Jesus. That the foundation of the covenant that was God's presence among his people takes a huge step forward in the person of Jesus. That God is still coming among his people, but this time you can give him a high five and a handshake and a hug. You can have a meal with him. You can talk with him. You can cry with him. You can laugh with him. Here's a picture of God that, like, not just that we can see, but we can physically wrap our minds around. That God takes the idea of presence to a whole new level. And what God does is this is where he brings the Missio Dei to its pinnacle. Because if you go back, again, what is the problem? Why is creation unraveling? Sin and death. So what God does in the person of Jesus, and ultimately where Matthew's story is building to, that we're going to get to in the next couple of weeks, is the life of Jesus centers on his death and resurrection. And his death and resurrection is about overcoming what's destroying creation. That Jesus literally takes the worst of it and then conquers it. Sometimes we get this picture that Jesus dies to like appease an angry God, that like God's upset and I need blood to make me happy. But that's not the story the New Testament tells. That what Jesus is doing is overcoming death. He's defeating it like in a battle. Like he takes it upon himself and he conquers it. So the New Testament writers will say, death no longer has power over him. Now Jesus is the ultimate authority, which is why Jesus will tell his followers, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And then his followers will say, and Jesus is bringing everything back to God, because that's who he is. So the Missio Dei reaches its pinnacle in Jesus because what Jesus is doing is he's overcoming sin and death, what's destroying creation, and he's bringing creation back to God. Because that's the way creation is designed to work, right? You have God, you have humanity as the stewards and rulers of creation, and then you have the rest of creation. Which is why when Jesus shows up, this is what he begins to say. And Matthew will say this, Matthew 4:17. From that time on, Jesus began to preach, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near. That Jesus, hey, I'm bringing this back under God. That I know way back in Eden, you thought you got rid of God, and then for Israel, he moved back in, but it seemed like Israel got conquered. No. He's coming back in full force to reclaim all of this, to heal creation, to save creation, to bring it back to himself. This is what Jesus is here to do through his teaching, through his life, through his death, through his resurrection. So it's on Jesus that the Missio Dei rests, that God's mission in the world to save the world is happening in and through Jesus, through his death and resurrection. But what Jesus also does is out of the ashes, he reforms the people of God. He starts within Israel and he invites these people and says, hey, why don't you come be a part of my movement? I know it seems like Israel's destroyed, Rome is now occupying at this point, but why don't you come be a part of my movement? And he tells them, he says, being a part of my movement has a very specific purpose. So when he calls his first followers, Matthew will record this, Matthew 4:19. Jesus will say to them, come follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. The following Jesus has a purpose. Following Jesus has a mission that is not about ourselves. It is outside of ourselves. Jesus says, if you follow me, then what you're going to be doing is engaging other people. There's a mission here. That out of the ashes of Israel, Jesus is reforming a people still for the sake of God's mission. Now that starts just within Israel, but then Jesus and his followers will really take this, they'll extend that beyond Israel. That this is no longer about one ethnic nation. It never was supposed to be in the first place. It was supposed to be a people that were for all people, but that's not what happened. So out of the ashes, Jesus begins to regather a people, but then he begins to extend it beyond. He's like, this isn't just about Israel. And so after Jesus' resurrection, before he ascends into heaven, here's what he'll tell his followers. Matthew 28, 18 through 19. Then Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. I conquered death. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. So he sends them out. You're going to go to all nations. I've done what I've done, and this is like the hinge point of the Missio Dei. This is the hinge point of God's mission to save creation, is my death and resurrection. And now that I've conquered death, I have all authority. So now, here's what you're going to do. Go. Go to all nations, go to all peoples, because you're fishers of people. That's what you are. And so Jesus reforms the people of God, this time known as the church, for the sake of the mission. And guess what the foundation of that mission is? Jesus will say in the next verse, verse 20, and surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. The foundation of the church's mission is the presence of Jesus with the church. But this is where it gets super cool, right? Because God moves in to a building with Israel. In Jesus, God lives as flesh and blood among his people. But then when Jesus ascends, what he will tell his followers is, I am sending to you my spirit, my presence to live where? Within you. The mission of God is founded upon God's presence in his people and his people's presence in the world. So Jesus says, I need you to go. I need you to be present with the world around you. I need you to be engaged. And know that when you are, I am at work within you. Because I'm no longer confined to one flesh and blood body in the person of Jesus. Now, wherever my people are present, I am present. And wherever my people submit to me and live with me as their Lord and King, there my work becomes visible and it becomes manifest. And what Jesus does right before his death is he uses some familiar language within the Old Testament story, within the story of Israel. When we get to what we call the Last Supper, Jesus having this meal right before he's about to be crucified, it's a Passover meal, and here's what he tells his followers. Matthew 26, 27 through 28. Then he took a cup, and when he'd given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant. So what Jesus does through his own life is he inaugurates a new covenant. A new covenant based really on the same thing the old covenant was. The old covenant was based on God's presence among God's people. This new covenant is based on God's presence among his people in the Spirit. But what's fascinating is what defines the old covenant is the law. Like the terms of the old covenant is the law. Like, are you faithful to the law? The new covenant isn't founded on a law. It's founded on a person, on the person of Jesus. And covenant loyalty is about allegiance to Jesus. Are we as individuals, are we as a church, are we as a community allegiant to Jesus? And when we live allegiant to Jesus, then his work becomes manifest among us. So we said in the beginning that mission is God's nature, right? Even one of the things that's hardest for us to understand about God is what we call the Trinity, the triune nature of God, that there is one God that eternally exists in three persons, Father, Son, and Spirit. The very essence of the Trinity and the idea of the Trinity is mission. Because look at how the Trinity functions. God the Father, what does he do? He sends the Son. Why? For the sake of mission. The Son, then, after his death and resurrection, and he ascends, what does he do? He sends the Spirit. Why? For the sake of mission. And the Spirit then empowers and sends the church. The whole idea of the Trinity, it's relational in its core, but it's also built into this missional nature of God, that this is who God is. That he is a God who is on mission to save the world. And the way he's extending his mission throughout the world is by his presence among his people. So I'm gonna put this phrase too, and I'm gonna read it because this is important. God's saving mission, centered on the work of Jesus, is being carried out by the work of the Spirit through the presence of the church. I'm going to read it again because it's kind of heavy, but it's big. God's saving mission, centered on the work of Jesus, is being carried out by the work of the Spirit through the presence of the church. It's God who saves. It's God who heals. It's God who restores. It's God who redeems. It's God who transforms. All of that is the work of God in the world. But the only way the work of God becomes manifest in the world, the only way people see it, the only way people draw attention to it, is by God's people's presence in the world. By us going into the world and living as faithful to Jesus. So when he says love one another, serve one another, be gentle, all those things, allegiance to Jesus, obedient to Jesus, when the people of God live allegiant to Jesus in their communities, when they go into the world and they live obedient to Jesus, the work that God is doing to save creation becomes visible. See, this is the story of Scripture. This is the story of Jesus. This is the why that Matthew's pointing us to. Matthew's saying, this is why. This is why he came. This is why he taught. This is why he did miracles. This is why he told stories. All of it gets at the heart of this mission of what God is up to ultimately, when you get to Revelation, to make all things new. See, this is why at FCC, we define our mission, like we have this mission statement. Our mission statement is pretty simple. It's living the grace and purpose of Jesus together. That's how we define our mission. This is our mission. And we take that kind of dual nature of God, that John says God is love. That's who he is. That's that grace part of it, that, yeah, we're going to love one another. That's not an easy thing to do, by the way. And if you've had a friend for longer than a week, you know that. Loving other people can be really, really difficult. But we love the way that Jesus loved. But at the same time, we also stay committed to the mission. That's that purpose aspect. That the church exists as a missional extension of what God is doing in the world. We do not exist for our own benefit. You know, organizations all the time, businesses, they exist for their stockholders, right? We're here to make money. We're here to do all this. The church does not exist for its own benefit, for its own sake, for its own glory. The church exists because God has a mission to save the world. And the church exists to extend God's mission out into the world. And always remember, what is God's mission based on? The presence. It's about his presence. It is God who is at work to save the world. You and I do not save the world. You and I will never save the world. You and I don't save ourselves. We don't save our families, our children, our spouses, our friends, our neighbors, as much as we might want to. And God will never force. God will never coerce. He doesn't work that way. God engages in his mission through the living embodiment of his people in the world. And so the big missional question for you and I, like for us as a church, is, are we living on mission? Like, how do we know if we're living on mission? The big missional question is simply this: where are we making space for God's presence? Because this is what God's people do. When you live as allegiant to Jesus in your home and in your workplace and in your community and on your street, what you do by loving other people, by serving other people, by caring for other people, by forgiving other people, by encouraging other people, what you do is you create space. Wow, we're supposed to hate one another because you voted this way, I voted that way. Wow, we're supposed to hate one another because we got into a fender bender or whatever. We're supposed to hate one another because your kid goes to this school, my kid goes, like, but you're loving me and you're kind to me and you're encouraging me and you're helping me and you're helping me take out my trash or mow my lawn. It creates space for God to be present and for his healing work to begin to happen in the relationships in our homes, our communities, our workplaces, our neighborhoods. God is at work in the Missio Dei, his mission, all around us. And we exist as a church to extend his mission out into the world to the places that we go. But we only do that when we live allegiant to Jesus and we create space for God's work to become known. So how do you do that? How do I do that? Are we doing that? God's mandate for his people is not to conquer. It's not to control. It's to go and to be present and to make his presence known. Every week as a church, we take communion. And hopefully when you came in, you picked up or got handed one of these little communion things. If you did not get one and you would like to take communion with us, go ahead and raise your hand, because we have people that'll come around and they'll pass one out to you. So you don't have to take communion if you don't want to, but if you want to, just raise your hand and keep it high, and they'll come around and they'll give you one. We said earlier that Jesus, when he got together with his followers for the Last Supper, he inaugurated what we call the New Covenant, and a new way of living in relationship with God, not founded on laws, but founded on Jesus. And Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection. That Jesus was the means by which God was bringing us back to him. The means by which he was healing and restoring. So every week as a church, we stop and we remember what it is that God has done for us in Jesus by taking communion. And we also remember who we are as the people of God. So if you want to go ahead and peel back that top layer, that clear layer, and you take that piece of bread, Jesus said, this is my body that I'm giving for you. He told us to do this in remembrance of him. So go ahead and eat that bread. Then you can peel back that silver layer, and it's the juice. And Jesus said, this is my blood of the new covenant that I'm pouring out for you. Go ahead and drink that. Jesus gave us his body so that we could be healed, forgiven, restored. And Jesus sends us out as his body to make known his healing, saving work, to make known his presence in the world. It begins with his presence within us. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your love. I thank you for everything you've done for us. I thank you that you are love and you are mission. And God, at any point you could have just turned your back on all of creation, and quite honestly, at any point you could have turned your back on each one of us. We talked about like the overall big story of creation and rebellion, but we each have our own stories of rebellion and failures, and we each carry around our own shame and guilt. And God, at any moment you could have just cut any one of us off, but you didn't. You never have and you never will. Because your nature of love and mission is what drives you. And you love us. And you are committed to saving us. And Father, help us to be as committed to you as you are to us. Help us to extend the love that you give to us into this world that so desperately needs it. Father, we thank you and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.